This is another reading from Executive Intelligence Review, Volume 8, Number 28, July 21st, 1981, Special Report. So, 1981, roughly, this is a special report that, to me, marks roughly 10 years into the decline, the marked decline of the American economy, and it links it with an ancient, extremely powerful force in world events going back to, I don't know, when did Venice really begin? 9th century, 10th century, but then by the 11th and 12th centuries it had emerged as, in the 13th century, when with the sack of Constantinople, Venice really emerges as the dominant sea power and becomes the most powerful banking center in Europe for centuries, and developed, which I might even suggest that the Venetian intelligence apparatus is perhaps the largest and most powerful in the world. I wouldn't be surprised if it is not still the most powerful intelligence agency running and controlling even MI6. Sounds a bit eccentric, but you know, people who watch my videos probably are at least willing to listen. I can't really go into the whole history of Venice. Just that, you know, you had an almost superhuman power in Europe that sort of was forced by 1509, after the War of the League of Cambrai, to diversify and sort of, you know, saw the writing on the wall, and kind of the Venetian fondi then set up, moved their fortunes to Geneva, Amsterdam, and ultimately London. And then you had the proliferation of Venetian parties throughout Europe, specifically in England. You had setting up of basically a doge system. You had the infiltration of England by the Venetians. And then, of course, you know, what I'm trying to expose is the fact that, in my view, the European aristocracy is the most powerful force driving world events, and it's what's behind what people think of as being the most powerful, you know, the nation states, and which are, you know, quickly becoming simply pawns of a centralized authority, which is based in Geneva mostly. When people look at the WEF or the WHO, the UN, in my view, these are front organizations, and behind them is the black aristocracy and the European aristocracy more generally. And I think that this is the real power. And I would suggest that most of this European aristocratic power is still, I think, you could make an argument that Venice is still number one. I can't say that for a fact. People say, well, do you have any books on this subject? Well, of course, there are very few books on this subject. The kinds of things I'm getting at would not be allowed to be published. You know, you can find books that kind of discuss going around the topic, and you can find supporting historiographies that kind of that if you look at critically, you might see evidence of what I'm talking about. But certainly there are no books about how the aristocracy today control world events, and I believe that they're driving military conflict as well. So anyway, I've also said that I have believed that the United States was doomed, and that there's nothing anyone can do. And it's because, I think, largely because of what's in this article. So I won't waste too much more time. Venetian Funds Recolonize the US Economy by Crichton Zoakis, Editor-in-Chief. America's strategically most important industrial and financial fortresses have been conquered in the course of the past 10 years by the ancient, semi-clandestine financial fortunes of the old black European nobility working through British, Swiss, Italian, Benelux, and Far Eastern banking front organizations. As EIR Economics editor David Goldman's accompanying analysis demonstrates, the critical controlling margins, in some instances over 35% of American industrial and financial equity, is now in the hands of ancient family fondi, i.e., funds whose pedigree goes back to the financing of the Crusades by Genoa, Venice, et al. From 1971 to 1981, the US dollar was devalued by about 50%, and US stock equity by about 70% as a result of combined inflation and stock market erosion. A similar collapse of the dollar and equity values in the American economy had occurred during the 1929-1933 period, which had then also led to European aristocrats buying into the American economy under the guise of panic gold flights from the potential European war zone to the relatively safer United States. Then, as well as now, American economic assets have been bought, quote, a dime on the dollar. Economic giants, which are considered symbols of American pride and arrogance, are thoroughly controlled by the same discreet and faceless oligarch financiers who have ruined the European economies. Chase Manhattan, bankrupt since 1978, now survives at the mercy of Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, which cut the Rockefeller Bank into the lucrative Asian money markets and dope trade. The merger of Chase Bank with the Warburg's Bank of Manhattan represented an earlier and only partial form of control over American commercial banking by the ancient fondi. California's Bank of America, founded by the old financial cult of Genoa and Venice, represents a more emphatic case of European oligarch financier control over American economic affairs. Xerox, Bendix, Texas Instruments, Standard Oil of Ohio, and other such giants, which the deluded popular mind identifies with American industrial excellence, are further useful examples of what the oligarchical fondi control in this country. A preliminary conclusion drawn from an in-depth study now being conducted by the EIR staff has already indicated that it would be reasonable to assume that virtually everything outside of the assets of regional banks and union pension funds is either directly or indirectly controlled by these oligarchical fondi. Assimilation of such a shocking fact would require that the student of this matter undertake 3 intellectual tasks simultaneously. First, do a number of experimental spot checks to determine the existence of these fondi. Easy to do. Well, not that easy. Second, study the method by which the fondi have operated throughout history and how they operate now in the United States. Third, make a serious effort to shed the dangerous, typical American delusions of America's being number one because of our free enterprise economy and so forth. The European oligarchy against which this country was founded is employing, quote, free enterprise techniques to take apart this country's economy piece by piece. What are the fondi? The fondi is a generic name traditionally given to the accumulated, highly diversified property holdings of historical family groupings. They are made up of large portfolios, each composed of real estate paper, industrial stocks, government bonds of virtually every government and every municipality, ownership of trading companies, paper, commodity exchanges, etc. To the extent that these massive, diversified holdings are kept together under the direct control of a family or a clan, they are fondi, i.e., a deployable instrument of their power. Investment banks and commercial banks, properly viewed, are mere front organizations of the highly secretive family fondi. Any one given oligarchical family may employ more than 2, 3, or 4 prestigious investment houses for the purpose of managing the continued survival and increase of the fondi. Management of the fondi is one thing primarily: capital flight. By capital flight, we mean, generically, the international deployment of mammoth sums of capital without the knowledge or supervision of governments. For the purpose of carrying out capital flight, the highly secretive owners of the fondi require investment houses such as Rothschild, Lazard, Hambros et al., which are halfway into the world of financial mist, sufficiently secretive to protect the anonymity of the powerful clients and sufficiently public to engage in capital flight operations. The origins of the modern family fondi are to be found in the era of Genoese and Venetian emergence to financial preeminence in the period of the Crusades, on the basis of fees earned for the shipping and transport services to crusading armies. The great families of Genoa established private fondi, which they later employed to buy up the House of Habsburg, and with it, the economies of Spain, Portugal, Austria, and the Low Countries. In the time of Emperor Charles V and Philip II, the Spanish court was dominated by Genoese creditor aristocrats who refused to trade in anything but pure paper. From the Spanish and Portuguese colonial ventures, the Genoese and the Venetian fondi moved to establish the Dutch East India Company and then the British East India Company. At a later point, Genoa and Venice jointly founded the Confederatio Helvetica, the modern Switzerland, as a world banking haven for the family fondi. The constitution of modern Switzerland was written by a senior Venetian intelligence game master, Giovanni Capodistria. Today's giants, British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell, are the best examples of Anglo-Dutch fondi established and organized by Genoese Venetian management. British Petroleum and Shell today call the shots in overall policy for the American oil majors. Virtually all of the best-known investment houses in New York City today function as fronts, covering up and clerking for the old European oligarchical fondi. Lehman Brothers, the firm of former Undersecretary of State George Ball, is owned by Banca Commerciale Italiana, which in turn is a subsidiary of Assicurazioni Generale di Venezia. Lazard Brothers is a front office for the fondi of the ancient David Weil family of France, Portugal, and Benelux. And this family is one of the key stockholders of Assicurazione Generale di Venezia. the world's largest insurance company. Assicurazioni di Venezia is an excellent case study of what the fondi are and how they operate. The board of directors of Assicurazione is made up of officers from Lazard Frère, Rothschild, Pearson, Fink, of the German Merck und Fink, Hambros, Lambert, and so forth. Among them, these 6 outfits represent total control and oversight over flight capital involving the major family fondi of France, Belgium, Germany, the United States, Italy, and Latin America. In addition, the board of directors includes the Duke of Alba, heir to the title of the Habsburgs Field Marshal in the Netherlands, the Doria family, the chief Genoese financiers of the Spanish Habsburgs, and the Giustiniani family of Venice and Genoa, descendants of the 6th century AD Emperor Justinian, who shut down the Platonic Academy, as well as General Giovanni Giustiniani, who betrayed Constantinople to Ottoman conquerors in 1453. When President John F. Kennedy won the election in 1960, a member of the Assicurazioni di Venezia, Andre Meyer, also owner of the Washington Post, boasted at a private victory celebration that, quote, "I own the President of the United States," unquote. The Kennedy family, of course, does its banking at Andre Meyer's Lazard Frères to this day. The irony, however, was that Meyer, the man who owned the president, was himself very low on the totem pole of oligarchical financial power. He had merely been selected as the temporary financial capo manager for the David Weil family fondi at a time when that family had shrewdly observed that none of its then living members had the brains to keep the family fortune intact for the next generation. So they hired Andre Meyer, and he tried to buy himself an American president to add to his boss's holdings. How the fondi operate. Andre Meyer may have discovered that buying an American president was not a simple proposition. It is reasonable to assume that that discovery probably cost President Kennedy his life. However, apart from the office of the chief executive, virtually everything else was being auctioned off, especially the secretaries of Treasury and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. In the less visible world of intelligence services and agents of influence, the managers of the family fondi had developed a highly effective clearinghouse of policy and operations, generally identified with the Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge in Italy. Most of the leaders of that lodge, as identified by the public prosecutor in Italy, belonged to circles associated with Assicurazione Generale di Venezia, Banca Commerciale Italiana, the versatile Banco Ambrosiano, circles influencing the Bank for International Settlements, the world's most powerful central bank of central banks. The Propaganda Due Lodge personnel were assembled during the period after the Second World War by Alan Dulles, then operating out of Switzerland, and Bruno Luzzatto, the Venetian financier who ran the Marshall Plan administration, father-in-law of Carter's ambassador to Italy, Richard Gardner of Billygate fame, Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, were promoted into public life as instruments of this P2 operation. In the middle of the 1960s, the European financial oligarchy had pretty much settled on the outlines of the strategy to finally take over the U.S. economy. The strategy is now known as Global 2000. The general weakening of potential American resistance was carried out by first establishing the so-called Eurodollar market, a pool for foreign-held United States dollar obligations of over 1.5 trillion in a supranational, quote-unquote, financial market that is beyond the regulatory reach of the U.S. government, and second, the delinking of the U.S. dollar from gold. Once the Eurodollar market was established at the beginning of the 1970s, the second tier of operations began, that of the gradual long-term corporate takeovers. The commercial operations of the fondi are buttressed by certain types of unique sources of gigantic cash flow. The fondi control the cash flow of the world's narcotics trade, estimated to be between $200 and $400 billion per year. They control the petrodollar cash flow, which slips through the fingers of OPEC countries to end up in the hands of fondi-associated commercial banks. Similar controls are exercised over certain key high cash flow commodity markets such as sugar and coffee. The general parameters for the deployment of such cash are set for the purpose of maximizing the influence of the fondi. Political perspectives of the fondi. The essential characteristic of the people who run the largest part of the West's financial institutions at this time is that they are fanatically dedicated to some of the weirdest forms of cultist world outlook. For instance, Robert S. McNamara, former head of the World Bank, is notorious for his habit of moonbathing under the shine of a full moon in order to improve his biorhythm, as he believes. Johannes Witteveen, former head of the IMF, is a high-ranking Sufi mystic. A.W. Clausen of the Bank of America is the highest-ranking Mason in the Grand Lodge, founded by Giacomo Mazzini, a thoroughgoing Lucifer worshiper. Similarly, with the leaders of the notorious P2 Lodge, which is closely associated with Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission. The emphatic ideological preference of these cultist notables is to place a permanent end to the era of scientific and technological progress and endorse worldwide a neo-romantic, variously dubbed the post-industrial society, the new dark age, the age of Aquarius, and so on. The significance of the fondi's takeover of key parts of the American economy is situated in this weird ideological commitment of the new management. The question for the United States as a state power is, what will happen if the Soviet leadership refuses to play along with the new Dark Ages game? Can the new management afford to happily dismantle the industrial and logistical infrastructure of the United States while the Soviet Union embarks on a desperate, determined effort to build up their military, industrial, logistical base to the greatest extent possible? The fondi have a very disturbing history of accommodating to this type of question in the past, when they had to make a choice between maintaining their ideological preference, i.e. their opposition to the dissemination of the scientific outlook in their societies, and the maintenance and salvation of the nation-states upon whose existence they depended. The old oligarchs have preferred the destruction of nations for the sake of their cult ideological commitments. In succession, they destroyed Genoa and Venice, their very basis of operation. Then Spain and Portugal, then Belgium and the Low Countries, then England, Switzerland, the Caribbean, Hong Kong are retained. Switzerland, the Caribbean, sorry about that. Switzerland, the Caribbean, Hong Kong are retained as stabilized bases of operations and playgrounds. — Now, they have come to the United States. The dilemma of the new management is, in order for the United States to recover industrially and strategically, it must pursue a Hamiltonian financial policy of redeeming our $1.5 trillion euro-dollar debt, and thus placing it under government, not private control, by means of return to the gold standard and further pursue a scientific and technological mobilization on a scale comparable to the earlier space programs. This kind of perspective would get the United States out of its present course toward the Dark Ages, and thus 180 degrees away from the ideological preferences of the new management. The alternative will be a resounding financial crash, probably toward year's end, and a drastic industrial and technological decline of the U.S. in a world affairs. The prospect of the Soviets' rule in the 1980s, as EIR founder Lyndon H. LaRouche has warned, will soon be on the table. A large part of the decisions in these matters will be decided at the upcoming Ottawa summit. Past history indicates that the fondi don't think twice before they double-cross and ruin the empires they have subverted and parasitized. So now, from the standpoint of 2025, we look back and say, well, there was no crash, arguably. But we also look across the landscape and we see that it's largely been deindustrialized. We see rampant, off-the-charts drug addiction. We see huge decline in the power of the dollar. We see the destruction of the American family. We see a decline in our political capital globally. We see the United States basically as a kind of enabler for the most despised forces on the planet, and therefore becoming a kind of overgrown pariah itself. We see Trump now coming into office, and what I'm still unsure of is whether he represents an opposing faction that will sort of swoop in and rescue the United States from having the plug pulled, which now, it looks like, as you look at the plans for the United States as laid out by the Committee of 300, they had said they were very much in favor of destroying the United States. There's tremendous hatred for the United States in the heart of aristocratic Europe. And that their plan was, they were very explicit about it, that they were going to bring down the United States, bring down Western Europe, in fact, and boost or move the fortunes and boost the fortunes of the East and the developing countries, the BRICS. And you see evidence that this is happening. We don't know if Trump will join up with that. We don't know to what extent he's really an informed nationalist, if he knows what to do. My question is it too late? Can we reindustrialize? Have people gone too far in the direction of moral dereliction and complete, the dumbing down, which is very real? If people are even capable of reindustrializing or innovating in any big way, or do we have the heart to get down to what's required to create new infrastructure, for instance? Or is Trump presiding over the end game for the United States? Basically, unless he were to join forces and accept as a businessman that probably an economic cooperative alliance with Russia is probably the smartest thing, and then therefore also linking up with the rising fortunes of the BRICS. If this is the way, then you have old Europe very much now. At this point, it's fascinating how People have always said that the Europeans were sort of the junior partners of the United States. We see now that's certainly not the case with regard to Ukraine and with regard to certain key human rights issues like freedom of speech. We're seeing a split now over Gaza. We're seeing a possible sort of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of advancement of the revitalization of some basic, truly American ideas, but we don't know. And this article that I just read is worrisome because it kind of, if you take it seriously, you wonder, well, if they've already bought everything and that basically the fondi through intermediaries basically own everything, what power, what do we have left? What's really ours? What can we call ours really? So that's where we are. Anyway, thanks very much for listening in. And I'd like to elaborate on this topic further.